From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I have just a couple of introductory words. First of all, welcome to this literary conversation. It is the first of its kind, and I'm thrilled to have Robert Casper from the Library of Congress, and of course Admiral Stavridis, who is a donor to the National Defense University Library and a star, as we all know. This idea came about a year and a half ago when Rob Casper and I were talking and thinking of ways for the Poetry and Literature Center and federal libraries to work together. So we came up with this idea, and I thought immediately of Admiral Stavridis. And the reason being is I know about Admiral Stavridis' love for literature. I was in the U.S. Army Europe Library Program and left and came here, and one of my colleagues called me that very summer that I left and said, "Guess what? I just drove the SACEUR to Stuttgart to go see Gary Steingart read." We had set up this author reading in our libraries, a series, and we were both floored. None of us in Europe had ever seen a Supreme Allied Commander step foot in the library. So this was wonderful. I'm sure Admiral Stavridis did all the time because he's that kind of guy. But so I knew he was the right person for the job. And as I just mentioned, he was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and the commander of U.S. European Command, as well as the U.S. Southern Command in Miami. He right now is the Dean at Fletcher. Rob Casper is the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. And previously, he was the programs director for Poetry Society of America. And he has, in fact, a literary magazine, Jubilat. So I'm going to let you go. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks.
And I want to, myself, before we begin, start by thanking Meg for all her hard work to make this event happen. It's been a lot of fun talking about this. This is the third event that we've done with the FedLink Associated Libraries, which are the libraries through federal institutions around the world. The first was an event called Pizza and Poetry. It was a noontime event at Andrews Air Force Base with a poet who has a officer husband and had written about it in a book. The second event was Poetry in the Stars at the U.S. Naval Observatory. So this is a wonderful third event and a compliment to those two. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to be up here today to talk
I
to
feel like
Admiral.
we're going downhill from pizza to stars to Stavridis, but I'll do my best.
We will have refreshments afterwards. No pizza, but you know, the conversation will be hopefully sustenance enough. So I just wanted to begin by talking to you a little bit about your background, your literary background.
Okay.
I'm sure you're used to talking about your military background, your professional background. But I wondered when you first fell in love with literature and what came first, the story or the poem?
The story came first, and I had Mr. President, great to see you there, sir. So the reason I became a reader, and I think all love of literature comes from a love of reading, is because when I was 5 years old, my parents moved to Athens, Greece. And this was in the early 1960s when there was effectively no television. So I lived in Greece 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, just as you're beginning to read. And unlike lots of other American kids who had the option of watching Bonanza and Mr. Ed and all kinds of great 1960s TV shows, I would go down to the library, and that was my entertainment. And I would come home with a stack of books, which gradually got bigger and bigger, and definitely began with stories. And as I matured and got into high school years, came to love poetry as well.
Were your parents avid readers as well? And did
Both.
They encourage you to read? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Both. My mother, who's 84, and let's see, this is Thursday. She's at kickbox aerobics today.
Wow.
She is an enormous reader and brought both my sister and I very much into the fold of reading very early on. And my father was a career officer in the Marine Corps. So my mother read literature, poetry, fiction, contemporary fiction particularly. My dad, as one would expect, and we have many military folks here in the audience, the first book I remember him giving me was the Anabasis by Xenophon, which is also known as the March Up Country. It's the story of a group of Greeks who find themselves trapped deep in the Persian Empire and have to fight their way back. A very great little boy kind of book.
Wow, that was the first book he gave you.
Yeah,
Set
exactly.
the stage, so to speak. Well, you talked about being a reader at 5. Yeah. Did you ever take on writing stories and poems?
I don't think so, beyond that, which I'm sure almost everybody in here did, which is little sketch drawings and kind of turning them into a little booklet kind of thing. I remember doing that, but throughout high school and then at the Naval Academy, I was very into journalism. I think in a strange parallel universe, I'd be a journalist. I love that profession, despite all the frustrations that sometimes come with the media and journalism. But I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and then I was the editor of the Log magazine at the Naval Academy, which is the only publication at the Academy. And it's poetry, literature, sports, humor. It's kind of a catch-all magazine. And as soon as I got out of the Academy, I wanted to continue writing, and so I began publishing in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, which is kind of the professional journal of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard and Merchant Marine. And I think, Rob, I have published at least one article at every rank, from midshipman to my current retired rank. And that became kind of a principal outlet, but I've also published in probably 20 different defense journals over the years as well.
And that was professional writing?
All professional writing, yeah.
And it's interesting, I mean, I looked at your incredible list of books, and, they're Watch Officer's Guide, Division Officer's Guide, Command at Sea, and so on. And in the middle of it is Destroyer Captain's Lessons of a First Command, which is really more of a memoir, and
it is
arguably a literary memoir. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about doing that.
I can. So I had done a lot of professional writing, and my books were effectively professional how-to guides. How to be a good division officer, how to be a watch officer and drive the ship, how to command a ship. So I finally got to command a ship, and it was called the USS Barry, and I loved it. And I thought, this is going to be a very fundamental experience in my life, being the captain of a ship for the first time. So, Rob, I kept a journal, and every night, no matter how tired I was, I'd kind of bang out 2-3 pages on my typewriter, still a typewriter in those days, early 90s, I guess. And so at the end of the tour, which was 2.5 years or so in command, I had this big, huge journal. And I thought, there's something in here that I can greatly reduce and boil down and make it, what I hope anyway, is a bit of a lesson learned for others, because the book is full of my mistakes. It's full of my doubts, my own sense of wondering if I would measure up to being the captain, something I'd read about forever. And, in the end, it turned out well. It was a successful tour, but many, many things went wrong. Yeah. And I wanted to write a memoir about command that conveyed that not every day is fabulous, and that you will make mistakes, and that the essence of anybody's life is not what they accomplish, it's what they overcome. Yeah. And I think that's what the book's about.
Yeah, it was interesting. The ways in which it seemed very literary to me were the ways in which it expressed a range of emotions, including, as you said, doubt. And of course, the great descriptions of moments at sea and the people that you worked with.
Thank you.
And you had little moments when you referenced literature. Joseph Conrad, as I recall, Master and Commander, Ulysses, the poem by Tennyson.
Yeah, sure.
And I wonder if you could talk about how those worked their way into both your experiences at the time and maybe affected writing that journal.
Well, let me start with Patrick O'Brien. For the nautical people in the crowd, how many of you have read 1 or 2 novels of Patrick O'Brien? Wow. Perfect. I'm in the home crowd
Yeah,
here. Well, as those folks know, Patrick O'Brien wrote what I actually consider the longest sustained novel of the 20th century, which is a 20-volume treatment of the relationship between Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin, a ship captain and his surgeon slant spy master. And it's really one long narrative, and it's just brilliantly executed. It's beautifully written. Think Jane Austen Goes to Sea. And it's lovely, lovely prose, but it's also full of the lessons of command. And I think what you're referring to in my tiny memoir, and I'm embarrassed to mention my memoir in the same breath as a Patrick O'Brien novel, but Patrick O'Brien has a sequence where Jack Aubrey takes command for the first time of a beautiful, beautiful, sweet sailing ship, Surprise. And he's being rowed out to the ship, and he says to himself, I find myself catching my breath. My heart beats fast. Will I be up to this? And I felt exactly the same emotion walking up the pier to take command of the Barry. It was very striking.
It was an interesting moment in the memoir because, yeah, as you said, it's the beginning of the memoir. You're about to get on the ship, and it's as if your mind reaches for those words, which are the exact words that help describe the emotions that are going through you. Well,
over the subsequent 2.5 years, I inflicted those books one by one on my wardroom, and they weren't absolutely required to read them, but if you wanted to be in the conversation on many evenings around the wardroom table, it would have been a good idea to read them. And so there was this set of really beat up old paperback copies of the books that were flying around the wardroom. And so now I'm finishing my command tour. It's like 2.5 years, and the wardroom has a party, which is very traditional, and they gave me a gift. And I was kind of expecting the traditional, clock, radio, barometer kind of thing that you put on your desk. They gave me at the time, the 17 volumes of the Patrick O'Brien novels in hardcover. And every time I look at those on my shelf, I think of that ship, of that wardroom, of the sea, and of literature.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because in the beginning of that memoir, you talk about reading in front of your staff, reading those novels in front of your staff, and sort of encouraging them to read too. Did you feel like in those 2.5 years there was a cultural shift that happened, or were the people that were walking by you, seeing you read those novels, the readers themselves?
Yeah, I think there was I wouldn't say a cultural shift, but I think many more people were encouraged to take a moment and to read and reflect. The other message I wanted to convey to the wardroom and to the sailors on the ship was that the captain has time to read a book, that you're not under such extraordinary pressure every minute, because you want a wardroom full of young officers and even young sailors who aspire themselves to a career and aspire to becoming the captain. And if the captain's always stressed out and screaming and yelling, who wants to be that person? Whereas if the captain is sitting in his bridge-wing chair, reading a novel of the sea, occasionally looking up to make sure you're not hitting a buoy, that's a better person to be. And so that was kind of the subtext. And I think I won some converts. I'll tell you, most interestingly to me, in the wardroom we had, as all Navy ships do, we had a half a dozen officers who were former enlisted men. In this case, they were all men at that time, although the ship later became a mixed gender ship, which is quite an adventure and a very good one. But of my half dozen Mustangs, we call them, I wouldn't say that any of them were big readers, just the nature of their lives and background. Yet by the end of that tour, they were all Patrick O'Brien aficionados. They might have been the most passionate people about Patrick O'Brien. And they were probably my greatest group of kind of converts.
Yeah, and do you think there was anything beyond sort of escapism, the relaxation that you were talking about in reading those novels that your staff, that the soldiers among you absorbed? You know, the power of the fiction to sort of paint a picture, or the sort of moral instruction, the complex issues that it grapples with behind the story?
Both. I think that the stories were and are incredibly entertaining, and I commend them to those of you who have not had the pleasure of that voyage. But as well, throughout the novels, as is always the case in great literature, you find episodic moments of real self-realization when you put yourself inevitably into the novel. Yeah. And you say, what would I do? How would I respond? What would be my value added in this situation? And because these are a series of long, complex novels of combat and relationships, and they're set both at sea and ashore in 19th century England, there is a great deal of opportunity for the reader to place themselves in challenging situations. I mean, at the end of the day, that's one of the most valuable aspects, I think, of reading fiction, is the opportunity to imagine yourself in a challenging situation and think, what would I do? Where's my moral character? Am I a person of courage? And sometimes when you're confronted with that, if you're honest, you can have surprisingly good and surprisingly bad reactions in literature, I think.
Do you think literature does that, and fiction especially does that, in a way that's unique to it as a form compared to nonfiction?
I think nonfiction has great power, and I don't mean to imply that I don't love reading biography and history and current events and political science. I do, as I'm sure everybody in this audience does. But for me, fiction, because it's fiction, often allows a more extreme set of circumstances in the imagination. It permits thinking through often dystopian futures, which I think is a fascinating genre of literature. And it allows us to find so many different niches in what we're going to pick, select, and read. So I think there's great power in fiction. I don't want to oversell it, but I think it should be part of everyone's reading diet.
Well, that, I think, is a great way for us to segue into the novels we discussed. You all should have gotten a handout, and in that handout, there's a list of, once you get beyond the poems, there's a list of books that the Admiral recommends. It was just basically a personal list that you put together of fiction, nonfiction, and some poems. And then a list of his top 5 books of 2013 with descriptions of those 5 books. But let's start with the author book poem list. And there were 3 books I wanted to talk about specifically. Sure. I wanted to talk about Hodgins' book, A Free Life, Dave Eggers' A Hologram for the King, and Cormac McCarthy's The Road. But before we begin that conversation, I want to note that those are all books by contemporary writers, and they're mixed up here with canonical books, books that probably all of you have read, Heart of Darkness, The Great Gatsby, 1984. And maybe you could talk about the value of contemporary writing in fiction versus canonical fiction.
Sure. Traditional fiction, if you will, that we've all approached has great value, I think, Rob, because so many people have read it. I could talk about The Great Gatsby, and everybody in this room would have either read it or seen the movie recently. The new Leonardo DiCaprio film, I think, is actually pretty good, although I'm a big fan of the Robert Redford film, as I think the classic Gatsby. There have actually been 3. But there's great value because we could have a conversation about Gatsby, about what does the green light at the end of the pier mean? Why do Dr. Eccles' eyes have those big glasses overlooking the road from Long Island to New York? And we could have a robust discussion because we're all in that discussion. So I think canonical literature, and I deliberately picked some books that I thought everyone would have read. 1984, I think everyone here has probably read or has familiarity with. So I think that's the kind of power. And then additionally, there's a reason they're canonical, which is that they're terrific books. And so teachers want to teach them, and people invest in them, and they're read 50 years, 100 years, 200 years after they're written. Yeah. The value of contemporary fiction, obviously, is that it tends to capture the zeitgeist of the moment. And I'll give you a great example, and it's one of the books on that list, which is the new book by David Eggers called The Circle. How many folks have read that or heard of it? Heard of it? Okay. And The Circle is a book that tells you why you should be really worried about the NSA, but you ought to be deeply terrified of Google, Amazon, Skype, LinkedIn, Twitter. It really makes the case in a fabulous story. And it's also a marvelous coming-of-age story wrapped up into this concern. But it's the zeitgeist of the moment that there are entities in the world who believe that privacy is theft, that by trying to be private, we're somehow stealing from the larger society. And this is, this is every day we're having this debate. I mean, this is Snowden, this is Bradley Manning, this is Julian Assange, this is WikiLeaks. So what I like about contemporary fiction is it can grab an issue of the moment, package it in a story, and spark a very real debate about the limits of privacy, about public-private partnership and competition in this context, and do it all telling the story of a very bright young woman who gets her first job at The Circle, which is a thinly veiled sort of conglomeration of Google, Amazon, kind of everything rolled into one. It's kind of 1984 meets Facebook. And it's a terrific novel by someone who I think is an incredibly creative writer. Yeah. David Eggers has published both fiction and nonfiction. His first well-known book is a heartbreaking work of staggering genius, which is a memoir of his life experience when both his parents die within a few months of each other, and he's left to raise his very, very young brother, who's 7 or 8 years old. And he's 22 years old. He wants to be in college. He wants to be drinking beer. He doesn't want to be standing at the playground with the moms. But that's what he does. And it's an incredible book, just full of heart. He went on to write What is the What? About the movement of young Africans to the United States. He wrote a book called Zaytoon about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. These are nonfiction books. Stack that alongside The Circle, which is very much a novel, and the book that's on that list, which I would recommend of all his books, which is, and what you asked me about, which is called A Hologram for the King. The king in this case is the king of Saudi Arabia. Hologram is hologram technology that a fictional company, probably like a Cisco-like company, is trying to pitch to the king of Saudi Arabia. So they hire a consultant to go to the kingdom who supposedly has some connections with the royal family, which are actually very weak. And it's the story of globalization. It's the U.S. competing largely against China in Saudi Arabia, selling technology. It could be anywhere in the world. But in terms of this collision between old culture, new culture, the business world, the public sector, the difficulties of doing business in the global world, it's just terrific writing and fabulous as a story, but really grappling with a big issue.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, too. I'm not surprised to hear that you're a big fan of Master and Commander, and that you brought it aboard your ship, and that there were other officers who read it and were excited about it. But you're probably the only admiral I will ever meet who's a huge Dave Eggers fan. And I wondered if
I'm probably the only admiral who knows who he is.
Yeah, indeed. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about about literature that obviously has a direct relationship to your work in the military or to military history or military themes, and literature that doesn't necessarily relate. And I thought an even better example of that, of the 3 books, is the Ha Jin book.
Sure. Now, Ha Jin is not a hugely well-known author. How many folks have heard of Ha Jin? Okay, that's pretty good. I guess that's why you'd show up for a lunch talk on literature. Ha Jin is Chinese-American. He was actually born in China. He emigrated to the United States, as many very bright Chinese do, to attend university here. He went to Brandeis. And then he began writing in English. So he's a little like Joseph Conrad, who is born in Poland, speaks Polish as his first language, then learns French. Joseph Conrad, one of the great writers of the late last century, 2 centuries ago and last century, Joseph Conrad, writing in his 3rd language. Ha Jin, which is a pen name, is writing in his 2nd language. And his prose is just so clear, so crystalline. It's a little like the Carlos Williams poem, which I adore, which you put up here. And so Ha Jin started writing novels about life in China. And probably his best novel, and he's written 3 terrific ones and probably 6 total, but his best book is called Waiting, like waiting, I'm waiting for somebody. And it's the story of a Chinese doctor who is married to a woman in the provinces, an arranged marriage. But the doctor has moved to the city and has fallen in love with a nurse in the hospital. And every year, the doctor goes back to the village and he says to his wife, I'd like a divorce. And every year she says, you have no grounds for divorce. I am faithful to you. I am here in this village. I continue to hold your life in my heart, and I don't want to divorce you. And every year he goes back to his nurse and he says, one more year. This goes on for 18 years. I won't tell you how it ends. But the book is fundamentally a metaphor about China's journey in the 21st century, right? It's this enormous rural population. It's this glittering future. And it's, where is China's heart? Where is China's head? It's a fabulous example of fiction that can illuminate a culture and a society. And we're lucky because here's a very brilliant novelist who is Chinese by birth, but who also has the capability to give us in English, because so few of us can read Mandarin, a novel that illuminates Chinese society in such a vivid way. Ha Jin has gone on to write other books, and his other book that I think is really worth taking a look at is called A Free Life. A Free Life. And this is the fundamental American story, right? I mean, what is the absolute leitmotif of the United States of America? It's the immigrant experience. I mean, this is a country of immigrants, famously a melting pot. That's our gift as a country. A Free Life is about Ha Jin's decision, thinly veiled in fiction, to remain in the United States, to not go back to China, and to embrace a free life. And it's a wonderful story of a tough beginning, working his way through college, and then he gets married, and they open a Chinese restaurant, and they move from New England to Atlanta, and it's the Chinese-American immigrant story, but it's really the story of all of our immigrant families. My own grandfather came here, and as I read it, I thought about my grandfather coming here in the 1920s, opening a Greek diner, and his life and his life experiences. And it's a marvelous novel, and again, Rob, it's a beautiful realization of our country's culture. Yeah. So here's one author who has, I think, captured so much of the Chinese experience and that of the United States. And he's well known in literary circles. I mean, he's won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize. He's been nominated several times for both. And he has many more great books in him. And I'm really excited because I'm going to have a chance to meet him in about a month because he teaches at Boston University. And I've just hooked up an appointment. I'm going to take all his books with me and get him to sign them. It's going to be great.
You should
just
give
another fan.
Give him a few books of your own.
Oh, yeah, hardly.
I wonder the kind of vision you're talking about, the kind of access to different cultures, to different worldviews, to the American experience in different ways that you found in these various novels. Has that ever helped you deal with a difficult situation in your military career?
Oh gosh, yes. I think in so many ways, a military career is just like every other life, but it's different. And so let me try and unpackage that and give an example. I think a military career is all about adversity and resilience. And I think that's really the story of everybody's life. But a military career also has, especially in today's all-volunteer force, has a fundamental component of deep patriotism for country. It has a relatively higher component of physical risk, and it tends to have a lot of travel, adventure, and life experience outside of the United States. So I think as you kind of put those two things on top of each other, and you think about literature, I would go back to Patrick O'Brien, which I think is a quintessential, again, single novel that really allows you to examine all of those kinds of things very clearly. I'm also, as you alluded to earlier, a big fan of Joseph Conrad's writing. And any number of his novels allow us to do this. I threw out Heart of Darkness. Another powerful novel, novella really, is called The Secret Sharer, which is about a sea captain who either imagines or maybe not that there is another entity in his ship with him. And it's really a reflection on command and the loneliness of command. And so I'd probably put those two writers at the top of my list in terms of people I've gone back to, multi-volume writers who have allowed me to think through difficult situations and in very reflective ways.
And have you seen, or can you imagine that literature could offer that kind of insight to members of the military, no matter what their rank is or no matter what branch they're in?
Absolutely. I happen to have given you a couple of examples from my corner of the military, the maritime world.
Yeah.
But one can find other novels, I think, that really illuminate different branches of the service. General Martin's old enough to have, I'm sure, read Anton Meyer's wonderful book about Army culture, and it was made into actually a fairly compelling mini-series. You can look at any of the services and find novels that I think are very fundamental to the culture and the core of those particular services.
In direct ways or in indirect ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I thought we'll just talk for a few more minutes and then we'll open up to your questions, but I thought we'd venture into poetry for just a few minutes and start with a very, very famous poem that gets a lot of criticism. Maybe you can talk about it and talk about why you love it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, like everybody, we could all put everyone has favorite poems. I love this one for the obvious reason that it's so simple. It's so clean. It's so focused. And I've come to appreciate this poem more and more and more as my own life has gotten more complicated, as I spend more time on a BlackBerry, as I spend more time traveling websites, as I spend more time managing big, complex organizations. And increasingly, I don't know about all of you, but I find myself talking to someone, doing my BlackBerry, thinking about a third thing. That's a very, I think, over time, a very dangerous place for all of us, individually and as a society. There's a big debate about this now, and it tends to go under the rubric of mindfulness. Mindfulness, the idea that we ought to stop and focus on one thing at a time and do it well. To me, that's this poem. Yeah. And I think that's what Doctor, and he was a physician, as you know, William Carlos Williams was trying to convey, was that what matters is our ability to appreciate the beauty in the world in the very simple things that exist in front of us. I think that's a dying art.
Yeah.
And I'll pull this poem out every so often and read it and put my BlackBerry away and just be mindful of where I am in the world.
Well, and you also talked in your memoir about rereading novels,
Oh,
and I wonder if literature, poems, and stories reward that kind of attention in ways that other texts don't.
I think very much so. To put it in the simplest way, to read The Great Gatsby, a novel we talked about a moment ago, as a 16-year-old high school junior, and then to read it again as a 56-year-old, as I did a couple of years ago, is reading two completely different novels.
Yeah.
We all bring ourselves to every novel, every poem, and so it's powerful to reread. There's a terrific book by Michael Durda, who's the literary critic here in Washington of the Washington Post, and I forget the exact title, but it's something like A Second Chance or Second Time Around. It's a collection of essays, very short essays by him, of I think it's 30 novels that he reread in his 50s and how they were strikingly different for him. And it's a terrific resource in looking and thinking about that. But I'd challenge everybody here, pull out a book that you think you really know well, Catcher in the Rye, Old Man in the Sea, any of the books on this list that you read in your teens or your 20s, and if you're now along in your 30s or 40s or 50s, and read them again. Yeah. The book I go back to a lot, I've read it probably 5 times, is Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, which is, the first time you read it is, it all sounds kind of fun. You know, it's this fiesta in Pamplona, and we're going to run with the bulls, and we're going to drink wine, and people are going to have affairs. You know, kind of you read that in your 30s and your 40s, and you start to get the undertone of real sadness that's shot through that novel. It's a tragic novel. And then now I reread it again recently in my 50s, and I thought PTSD. I mean, this is the aftermath of World War I. This is the lost generation, Génération Perdue, that Gertrude Stein wrote about. So every time you reread one of these canonical, iconic kinds of novels, you'll bring something different to it. The Indians say you never cross the same river twice, you know, because the river moves on. It's the same with literature.
Yeah. Let me just see if you have questions you want to ask Admiral about Literary Matters. We have some microphones, so if you don't mind, we'll just go over.
First of all, I'm Walter Statler. I've been associated with the university for quite a while, and we served together, I believe, a number of years ago in the early 90s here.
We did.
And first of all, thank you so much for those insights. They're absolutely marvelous. But what I really want to say was I'm so pleased that you mentioned Xenophon's Anabasis. I didn't read it until several years after you did, when I was 14, in a military high school in the middle of New York City, by the way.
Wow.
And I was, as a child, basically, trying to become an adult eventually, was struck by so many of the images, not only in Xenophon, but also in the Iliad and particularly in the Odyssey. Speaking of the sea, Odysseus sailing through, tied to a mast, sailing through the straits, Scylla and Charybdis and whatnot. Exactly. I noticed there is no mention, of course, in the list that we got of any of these classics. I think a name that has basically killed what we refer to as the classics, and yet there are so many powerful images and so much to learn and whatnot. Do you see any hope of increased interest in that type of literature?
I do, in 2 different dimensions. One is that increasingly novelists are taking these stories, the Odyssey being sort of the classic, and reimagining them as novels, as films. And so, without any doubt, they will live on in that context. In the context of, are people going to pick up and read the Odyssey and read the Iliad and read some of the texts, I think there's declining interest in that in the academy. However, I think there'll always be a foundational piece in particularly in our Western literature, that will harken back to any number of those. One course that I teach from time to time is a course in literature of the sea, and I always teach the Odyssey for all the reasons that you described.
Kurt Muller, Center for Complex Operations. I'd like to ask you a question with regard to your change from being in the military to being an academic.
Sure.
And let me set this with an item. One of your predecessors, Sakur, when he was president of Columbia, was addressing the employees of Columbia, the faculty, and was corrected by a faculty member saying, General Eisenhower, we are Columbia University. That retort displays a considerable amount of academic arrogance, showing again a disconnect between Eisenhower's previous experience in the military and what the academic enterprise is about. We're confronted in these days with a lot of difficulty of interacting with academics, particularly in some disciplines that have a considerable mistrust of, we can say, the federal government at large, not just the military. Have you experienced any of that, and anything that you'd like to share with us as to how to better that dialogue?
Well, I get this question a lot, as you can imagine. It tends to boil down to, gosh, what's it like coming out of the military, where everybody does everything you tell them to right now, to being in academe, where nobody does anything you tell them to? And I say, well, you know, I was in a halfway house called NATO. I think actually the two cultures are not as far apart as the caricature. I think that for me personally, because I'm going to Fletcher, which is a graduate school of international relations, it's multidisciplinary. I'm dealing with extremely mature students, average age 28, 29. I'm dealing with a brilliant, tenured faculty that knows their place in the world, has great pride in the Fletcher School. We're a very grounded institution. We're very proud to be part of Tufts University, which is a rising star in the world of research universities. So we're in a pretty good place, and as a result, we don't have the kinds of stresses and strains that I feel in other institutions, if you will, around the circuit. I do think that, well, I'll tell you one other anecdote, which is the president of my university, who's this amazingly brilliant synthetic biologist named Tony Monaco. He has his bachelor's degree is from Princeton. He got a dual MD and PhD from Harvard. He's perennially mentioned as a Nobel candidate in synthetic biology. And he was asked, Tony, why'd you hire a military guy to run the Fletcher School? And he said, well, I wanted to have one dean who knew how to follow orders. So those are sort of the anecdotes. I think at the end of the day, leadership in the academy is the same as leadership anywhere else, which is to say it's about transparency, it's about innovation, it's about making tough choices, it's about sometimes disappointing people because resources are not infinite, it's about creating strategies, and it's about building teams. Those are true whether you are the departmental chair of political science at Kenyon College, or you're the president of Columbia, or you're the dean at the Fletcher School. So challenges certainly in this academic world, and the civilian side especially, The expression these days is the value proposition. The tuition at Tufts University is $60,000 a year. And the students want skills. They want practical entree into the real world. And we've got to deliver that. One thing I emphasize to my faculty, who very much are the heart of the Fletcher School, I'll say that, I'll stipulate that, the faculty are the heart of the school. But I say to them, always remember there's another name for students, right? It's customers. And I think that's an important part of the leadership component in the academy.
You bring up an interesting question, though, in relationship to literature.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, terrific novel on this subject, very little known, is called Stoner, which is a man's name by John Williams. Yeah, I'm sending a copy to everybody in my faculty. It's an amazing novel about the stresses and strains in the academic world. It's set from about 1940 to 1975 or so. It's the career of Professor Stoner at a fictional college, beautifully realized. Sorry.
That's okay, it's okay. A real problem that the university faces right now is a great decrease in English majors throughout the course of the last 20 or 30 years, in part because of that sense that people are paying a lot of money for college. Right. They need to be focused on results. Right. They want to get jobs as they get out of school. The liberal arts education doesn't have the same kind of value. Yeah. And especially with poetry, there's a sense culturally that it's elitist, that it's academic, that it really only belongs in the academy, and that only other poets talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could sort of address both of those issues in your particular position and sort of growing up in the military as someone who loved literature.
Well, let's talk about the other academy. So we'll talk about the Naval Academy for a minute. And when I was at the Naval Academy, I was an English major, but also had a very heavy concentration in electrical engineering. So I graduated with my BS and went forward. And people would say to me, well, you know, boy, you must really know electrical engineering, and that must be really, really useful, you know, because ships are full of wires, and you need to understand that, and motors, and radars. And I would say to people, you know, honestly, in the, you know, kind of the 35 years of my career in the Navy, I can tell you honestly, I used what I know about electrical engineering maybe twice. Every single day, I used what I learned as an English major. I read, I analyzed what I read, I empathized, I thought about outcomes and solutions, I wrote and communicated. I did that every single day. So I would argue there's pretty good value in the liberal arts education. The trick is the marketing. And if you really look at consulting firms, tech firms, innovation cells, they're all over hiring people who have these kind of skills. And my own daughter's an example. She went to the University of Virginia. She was an American Studies major, which is essentially an English major with a concentration on the United States. And she got out, immediately got a job with Google, and has been there for 7 years. Now, she's not writing code for Google, but she's doing Google ideas and very creative things. Another example, a good friend of mine, his daughter just finished up a PhD in English, decided she didn't want to become a teacher, fair enough. She got a terrific job working for Bain. So I think there's a realization that it's about the kind of creative, innovative skill sets. You know, increasingly, let's face it, we're going to use technology to solve technology problems. We're not going to rewire motors. We're going to have a machine that does that. The Internet of Internets is going to drive this. It's the creative impulse that I think is going to be extraordinary and valuable going forward.
Yeah. There are other questions? Yes. Just take this as the last question.
Yeah.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Margot Shorey. I work here at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, but I'm also a recent, I graduated in May from Fletcher.
Congratulations.
So, thanks.
Well done.
So I find that recently I've been, when I'm lucky enough to get a seat on the metro, reading for 10 minutes at a time on my way
Sure.
here. And that's very different than being able to sit down, when you're on vacation and read a whole book. So you're obviously very busy and have always been very busy. So when do you find time to read? And do you feel like that changes, and changes how you read a book?
Yeah, I think it is very hard to block out big chunks of time to just sit and read. And I've really trained myself to read 10 minutes here, 17 minutes here, 14 minutes here, plug in and listen to a book on tape. I read on airplanes. Anytime I get a moment to read, I'm going to read. And that's point A. Point B is, it's like a diet. You don't want to eat junk food. You want to be conscious about what you want to read and have a plan. Think about it. I try to read nonfiction, fiction, fiction, nonfiction, fiction, fiction, nonfiction. Others may reverse that. Others may read strictly nonfiction. But Voltaire said, the most discouraging thing in life is that one could enter the National Library in Paris, begin reading in the first alcove, and be dead before one exited it. Point being, there's an infinite amount of books. So you have to be an informed consumer of it, the same way we're informed consumers about healthcare, informed consumers about buying a car. Why would we spend less time thinking about what we put in our brain than we do in our digestive tract? So I think find little pockets of time to read. Try and stay up an extra half an hour later. That's hard. Everyone's physiology is different. Use books on tape when you can. Use technology to help you. And have a plan about what you want to read. And the other thing I tend to do is I also write down all the books that I've read. Nothing complicated. And then I put a few sentences against it. And once you've done that for a year or two, you start to realize what you like and what is valuable and what really spoke to you as a reader. So I'd say reading is like learning to play tennis or having a good diet or working with a good yoga instructor. It's a skill you hone and you develop as you go through life. I just happen to think it's the best skill you can hone in the long throw of your life. Thanks for going to Fletcher. And thanks to all of you for coming out today. What a pleasure. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.